What you're saying is that there is an elite problem in Britain, but it's an economic elite problem, and Farage embodies that elite.
As with Farage, there's always some truth to what he says, and I think that's why he's often enormously popular. The difference is, though, his solutions will often cause more division. The Greens are very different to that.
You do think it would be a good idea if the UK broke up?
I can hear the scepticism in your voice, but I think what I'm saying is utterly morally consistent and coherent.
I'm a bit
because
skeptical.
actually what I'm saying is the power should be at the most local level.
The Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana outfit, which he's supposed to have got going. Is there any point to them now, do you think?
I'm really secure in what the Green Party are doing and the fact that we are becoming a huge major party.
Are you talking to any Labour MPs about defections?
I'm going to... I feel like the indiscretion is there, and I'm going to just leave it there.
Well, we're joined now by the man himself, the man of the moment, it seems, certainly in left-wing politics, Zack Polanski.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's our pleasure. Look, the point of these extended conversations, right, is to have a conversation. It's not supposed to be a sort of deeply kind of like classic interrogative kind of a radio interview. We've done that bit of that. So this is going to be about your principles, really, and your political life. But before we sort of...
You can interrupt me if you want, though.
Well, it might happen. We'll see that. We'll see. It might happen. Just before we get onto that, though, how long have you been Green Leader now?
About 35 days.
35, that's very specific. 35 days.
Well,
it must have been heady.
Well, there's an amazing stat that every single minute, 24/7, we've had a new member. That's how many new members we've had since I became leader. 110,000 at time of recording.
And what were you on at the time of your...
68,000, I think,
okay.
Which is for the whole membership, it's a 55% increase across our entire membership of the Green Party. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. I'm aware of every moment someone asks me, the first reaction is things are going incredibly well, and I don't think there's any point in pretending otherwise. It just feels really exciting. People are stopping me in the street quite regularly, and it's kind of constant saying, I feel hope, we can really do this, and I'm feeling that too. And at the same time, I look at the state the country's in, I think about the challenges that are facing us, I think particularly about reform, and you go, yes, it's really important to celebrate, and it's really important to share this moment of hope and joy. But you can't stay in that moment. You've got to turn it into electoral success.
And obviously, you won the Green Party leadership by almost kind of sort of dictatorship levels of sort of rigged election kind of levels of a margin.
It was a democratic election.
No, I don't. Of course it was, but it was 85%. You don't normally get it. It was a crushing victory, I think it's fair to say. Why do you think that was? It was such a clear endorsement of your vision from the party itself, and for the direction in which you wanted to take it, which was clearly different to your opponents. Why do you think it was so crushing?
I can partly thank you, Lewis. So you did an interview with Owen Jones about maybe 6-9 months ago,
yes,
where you were talking about the Green Party. And you said that they really needed to take a leaf from Ed Davies' book, The Wetsuits for Stunts, for Gimmicks. And everything in me said, I just don't think that's right. I think the fundamental problem here is we're not communicating a very compelling vision and story the Green Party have.
So it's not really the rise of Zack Polanski, it's the rise of Lewis Goodall. That's what you really said.
There you take all the credit. And for being wrong, I think.
Being wrong,
no.
right. That's happened
Well,
before.
no, it wasn't even wrong. I think what you were saying was legitimate. I think there would have been a space to actually be a zany character and get out there and do the gimmicks. But I just thought the reason why Ed Davey, I think, needs to do the gimmicks is because they have 72 MPs, and I'd love to have 72 MPs, so I'm not knocking that. But 72 MPs that I don't think believe in the same thing. I don't think there's a coherency around their political project.
It used to be a Lib Dem, of course.
Right, yeah. I mean, 10 years ago.
Yeah. You know the
still being held for the sins. Yeah, it is a party, I know. And there's a strong left in that party, and that's for the people I was aligned with. But I think, Ed Davey literally wrote the Orange Book. He was a minister during the coalition. And so they've got people like Josh Barabundy, who I think is a great MP, who is, I would say, clearly on the left of the party, to people who I would say are to the right of where Labour are and could even be in the Tory party. And so they've got this huge spectrum of MPs where I don't think they have that unified voice and message. But the Green Party, our story is really clear. We want to lower bills, we want to tax billionaires, we want to protect the planet and tackle the climate crisis. And I think when you can communicate in those terms with a really strong narrative that can cut through, you don't need to do gimmicks.
But that is a very particular vision of the party, because, of course, the Green Party itself, although up to now at least it's been much smaller than the other parties, itself has had division, right? In a way, the division between you and your opponents in that election showed that you had two very different sort of approaches. One is, as you've just described, and we'll sort of get onto this in a bit more detail, but it is this more eco-populist kind of vision. It is about more sort of left-wing, unashamedly left-wing, radical agenda. And the other, of course, is about being more unashamed and more focused, perhaps exclusively on green issues, maybe not rocking the boat as much, maybe appealing less to urban voters and more rural voters. Now, I'm sure you'll say there's no division between those things and so on, but it was a distinctive vision, wasn't it? It was shifting the Green Party from where it's been, at least to some extent.
Oh, I think the first thing to say is, without relitigating the leadership election, is that it was very noticeable there was almost zero difference around policy and around what the Green Party
Adrian
should actually
Ramsey
be doing
didn't
in
seem
Parliament.
to like you very much, though.
Well, but this is what I'm saying. So in terms
Yeah.
of policy, though, like very, very much the same vision. I think the real difference was about how we communicate. And what has really struck me as leader, and almost I thought, if I'm really honest with you, I thought it was a problem I was going to have that I'm currently not having, is that even in our rural seats and rural communities, I'm getting messages every single evening saying, double the amount of people turned up tonight, triple the amount of people turned up in terms of members' meetings. Now, that doesn't mean winning elections. We've seen that in history with leaders who are very popular, who have massive membership and then don't go on to win the election. So it's not enough to win those rural communities. But it's a very clear sign that it's not that those rural communities, suddenly people aren't turning up or going, I don't believe in Zack's vision. It's quite the opposite. They're going, this is the vision of the Green Party that I want to see.
How's your relationship with your parliamentary party? With Adrian Ramsey and Ellie Chowns, who ran against you? Are you all getting on now?
With Ellie Chowns, it's superb. I think from literally the moment that result was announced, I saw Ellie go do an interview where she just said, the election's been decided. This was Zack's vision. And I thought she gave a really good answer the other day in an interview. Someone kind of pushed her and said, do you think you should have been more Zack during the election? And her response was perfect. She just said, I'm Ellie, Zack's Zack. We've only got to be ourselves.
And what about Adrian?
So Adrian's father's died a week or two ago. So he's been on compassionate leave. So I just genuinely haven't seen him. But also the thing I would say is I was his deputy leader for the last 3 years, and there were lots of things that we didn't agree on, and we have worked together professionally and collegiately, and I just know that will continue. I think where the Green Party are different, say, to the Labour Party, is the Labour Party have a history of factional infighting. We just don't have that in the Green Party.
You can develop one, though.
We can develop one, and I'm determined as leader to work with the MPs and make sure that
Do the Green
doesn't happen.
Old Guard like you?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's...
Really? Are you sure?
Yeah,
There's no tension?
I think the tension is about, some of them I think would like to see me talking about the environment more and the climate crisis more, and I think that's undoubtedly a tension. The argument I make to them both publicly and privately is that when you poll people, the Green Party are the most trusted party on the environment, including with other parties.
You've got that territory.
Well, yeah, so when I've got a
By
microphone
definition.
with me, why would I convince you of my credentials or the Green Party's credentials on the environment? I mean, I've chaired the Environment Committee for the last few years in London. I deeply care about the environment, but people know that. What they don't know is our plans to tackle the cost of living, our plans to protect the NHS, our policies on education or health. And I think it's important to talk about those other policies, as well as the climate. Climate will always run through everything we do. But in terms of the first thing I talk about, it doesn't make sense to lead on the climate, despite the fact it is the most pressing issue. It's an
And you are called the
existential issue.
Greens.
Well, exactly. So we're called the Green Party. Everyone knows that we care about the climate crisis. We want to reduce emissions. We need climate adaptation. I think there's other more interesting routes through it, though. So last week there was a report from the Security Council, the intelligence chiefs of the government, that said the biggest national security threat to this country, or one of the biggest, is food insecurity around the climate crisis. Now, last Thursday, the government were going to launch this report. And according to The Guardian, they've sat on it because they're not ready to deal with the consequences. And so I think there's an interesting conversation there about how did the Green Party become more prominent on issues that people don't associate us with, like the security of this country, but do them through a different lens. So not always talking about nuclear weapons, but actually saying how we're going to protect this country from a pandemic, from the climate crisis, from food insecurity, as well as the security of this country from the more traditional things as well.
So it's interesting, is it? So you're, and I think this is clear tension with some of your members, because of course some of your members will say, and I've interviewed them and others of your kind of sort of political bent, they'll say, look, the climate crisis is the most existential thing that's facing our planet.
And they're right.
Almost talking about anything else is wasting our time, because everything else pales into insignificance by comparison. What is distinctive, I think, for people to understand listening to this about your approach, is that it's different. You don't agree with that?
Well, I do agree it's absolutely the existential threat, and I agree that it's rooted throughout everything. So if we talk about the housing crisis, for instance, a housing crisis, we need rent controls, and you can absolutely link rent controls with retrofitting. The fact that we're still building houses right now that will need to be retrofitted in just a few years' time. What I mean by retrofitting, so if we're insulating homes, for instance, that's going to keep them cool in the summer, warm in the winter. That reduces bills, vital in the cost of living crisis. It creates green jobs. That's amazing for working with the trade unions.
There. That's the point, isn't it? You don't start from the climate element. You start from an economic element.
I think that's exactly right. So if you're Greenpeace or you're Extinction Rebellion or an organisation that aren't a political party, it makes absolute sense that your whole thing is the climate crisis and to raise the alarm on the climate crisis. And I work with those organisations really well, and I'm really glad they exist. The Green Party's job is to campaign, to win seats, to change things within Parliament, the London Assembly, councils. So to make sure that we're using the power that we gain to be able to create change. To do that, why would you start with an issue that you know people aren't as concerned yet about as they should be? Now, it's part of our job, but more the wider movement's job, to raise the salience of that issue, to make sure that when people wake up, the first thing they're thinking about is the fact that we're not spending enough money on climate adaptation, that we're at risks of floods and wildfires, and we need to reduce our emissions. We're not in that place, though. We're in a place where people are worried about putting food on the table, heat in their homes. But the really important point here, and it's probably the most important point I'll make, is if we talk about inequality, the poorest communities are the ones that are being hit as hardest by the climate crisis. So they're not separate conversations. They're the exact same conversation.
Do you think that maybe part of, let's broadly and rather inexactly call it sort of environmental movement, all of the, whether it's the political party, the Green Party, or, you know, some of the groups you've identified, has there been an element in the past of maybe it being dominated by quite middle-class people who don't really understand just how hard-pressed people are? Is your leadership and what you're saying, in a sense, a critique to that view?
Undoubtedly, it's a searing critique of it, of the broader left and the broader Green movement. I think it's really striking that Asad Rehman, who used to be the CEO of War on Want, so this is a charity who work exclusively around global South inequality and around poverty, is now the CEO of Friends of the Earth. And I think that's Friends of the Earth, along with Greenpeace, also recognising that the real big threat to our environment is inequality. It's multimillionaires and billionaires, the big polluters, Shell, BP.
So you think that people in the Green movement, and I say rather than just the party, the movement, let's call it that, have been patronising in the past about these matters?
Yeah, I think that's true as well. And I think, you know, I want to balance this with there are stalwarts of that movement who have been talking about this for decades. It's not like I've just arrived and I'm the first person who has linked environmental, social, racial and economic justice. There have been people doing that for a long time. But for a long time, there were slogans and phrases that look to minimise the devastating effects of poverty and the devastating effect of needing a job or needing employment with being insignificant matters in light of the climate crisis. Now,
or judging people, perhaps, for
right.
flying. You think there's been too much of that sort of stuff as well?
I think, and so something I talk about a lot is the fact that, look, I don't fly, I'm vegan, I don't drive a car. So if you wanted to give me a kind of purity test on being green leader, I'm going to pass that test. But I'm partly passing that test because I've got a microphone in front of me. And if you were someone who was less conscientious in your approach to journalism, you might turn this whole conversation into a hit piece about my personal choices. That's all nonsense, though. If you can make those personal choices and you have the power and the privilege to do it, I'd always encourage people to make the right personal choices. That's missing the point, though. It's a bit how carbon footprint was created by the oil and gas companies to distract from the system change that was needed. If we're all pointing at each other and talking about individual responsibility, we're missing the real picture. And the real picture is that the 4 wealthiest people in this country own more wealth than 20 million people combined. And what that is polluters who are destroying our environment, but they're also destroying our democracy and they're destroying our communities.
So you're going to go into the next general election, and climate's not going to be at the top of your priorities. It's not going to be the thing that you're talking about first and foremost and principally when you're in those debates and when you're talking in interviews like this.
So it depends on context. Where I'm elected in the London Assembly, I regularly challenge Sadiq Khan on climate issues and on environmental issues. Because when I'm in the chamber, that's not a comms piece to the wider public. That's doing the work. That's saying there are emissions that need to be reduced. There's climate adaptation that needs to happen. You're the mayor of London with your hands on the levers of power. I'm going to hold you to account to make sure this work is done. Now, whenever I push out that work, there's a small group of people who are already really interested in this stuff, who share it and they're pleased they're doing that work. But that's not the point, to please people. The point is to get the work done.
But you want people listening to this and people, when they think about Zack Polanski, and if you know this, in the attention economy that we're living in, most people don't have time to think very much about politics. And one of the whole premises of what you're doing is you want to grab people. You're grabbing people's attention, all the videos you're doing and so on, and you're succeeding. But as you know, most people have fragmentary appreciation of politics. When they think of you, what do you want them to think of? Inequality? Climate? What's the one word?
The fact that I'm going to protect people in poverty or empower people in poverty.
So it's about economics. It's about
yeah,
policy.
I think it is about economics. And so I've launched my own podcast, Bold Politics, which went to number 3 in the charts. But actually, it's noticeable to people that I've had 5 or 6 guests now, and we haven't yet done an environmental climate episode. That's not because I don't care about the environmental climate. I care deeply about it. I wanted to make sure that I set my stall out on other issues. Now, that doesn't mean in those debates I won't be going hard at Keir Starmer or whoever the Prime Minister is by that point around their complete... I mean, let's talk about climate. The fact that we have a government who say they care about climate, but they're expanding airports, they're looking at reopening or opening the Rosebank oil field, is such an outrageous attack on the futures of our children and grandchildren that I would go so far as to say it's sociopathic behaviour. So in terms of like...
Although to go back at you, I mean, if you're thinking about, you want to make your focus about economics and about cost of living and about putting money into people's pockets, one of the arguments to open Rosebank, which is that look at the economy of the northeast of Scotland. There are thousands and thousands of families there who rely on North Sea oil and gas, and that transition to take longer. So this is the problem, right? There are trade-offs, and some people, given your focus on the cost of living and so on, will choose to prioritise those families'
Well,
incomes.
we're relying on those jobs because David Cameron said famously, let's cut the green crap. Let's make sure instead that it's not green crap, but actually it's green investment. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs waiting
as well
in
as
this
I do
country.
as well, that in terms of making that, I mean, this is where I think there is potentially a tension in your politics, right? Which is that on the one hand, you want to focus on putting money in people's pockets, cost of living and inequality. On the other hand, as you know, the green transition is important, it's vital, it's also going to be enormously costly, and there is no projection, and no sensible projection that I've ever seen, which shows or demonstrates that you're not going to, in the short term, going to have to levy extra costs on people's bills in order to fund that transition. So where's your priority?
I disagree on 2 counts. So first of all, Howard Stern did a famous report that talked about the cost of inaction.
Yeah.
So actually I think there is lots of data and lots of evidence.
But that's long-term cost for people. And in the short term, you're going to end up asking, as this government is doing, to basically have extra money on their energy bills to fund that transition. But you're all about focusing on the cost of living and making sure that people aren't getting poorer. So where is it?
Well,
Where's
we
the
can
priority?
walk and chew gum at the same time. I'm focusing on the cost of living in order to tackle the climate crisis.
Yeah, but in the short term, it affects people.
Even in the short term, the climate crisis is affecting the cost of living. If you have a flood and you live in a basement flat...
So you're willing to say to someone on benefits, like, you've got to pay an extra £100 a year in energy bills to fund that green
we don't
transition.
need to say that to people on benefits if we have a fair taxation system. And so these are all choices, political choices that are being made by this government. We can make different political choices that do not pit jobs against the climate crisis. I think it speaks to how damaging and eroding the frame has been of neoliberalism for the last 30, 40 years since Thatcher, that we're even having this conversation where we're putting the binary of protecting our environment and protecting people's livelihoods.
There are trade-offs.
I think they're not trade-offs. I think actually they're advantages, and I think they've been accepted as trade-offs because people have accepted the frame that tackling the climate crisis has to result in the loss of jobs. If you get the just transition properly, you can invest in jobs.
Not necessarily, but it probably does involve people, everybody, making an extra contribution financially to fund it in the short term to get the benefit you're talking about in the long term. And I suppose that if you one more to make a critique of you is that, I mean, you describe yourself as an eco-populist, and one thing that you might have in common with Nigel Farage, something I know that you'll balk at, or any populist, indeed, or any populist, is basically you don't engage in the politics of trade-offs. You say it's all going to be fine. We just need to just approach politics in a completely different way and everything will be fine and we don't have to make those tough decisions. But sometimes in politics, and if you were to get into government, there are those trade-offs which do exist. And you can say, well, we're going to reframe the tax system and rewire the tax system and so on. Maybe that will generate the extra revenue that you think. Maybe it won't. And if it doesn't, then you're back in what the Labour government position is at the moment, which is the hard yards of actually governing.
I think the trade-offs are that I have to sit through interviews and make what people see as difficult arguments, but I see as very clear, coherent arguments where I'm backed by science, and I'm backed by history, by the way, too. So let's look at the Attlee government. As a response to the Second World War, the NHS was set up, huge house-building programme, huge kind of reinvigorating our economy. That was a response to a crisis. We're in so many crises right now, I probably can't list them all. We have an inequality crisis, we have a climate crisis, we have a nature crisis. We live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. And so there's this moment in history that we're in right now where we can invest in dealing with all of these crises, not in a way that disadvantages the country, but quite the opposite. Will there be a trade-off for multimillionaires and billionaires? Yes, absolutely. But the only trade-off there is people being able to see that when we hear these constant arguments about won't they just leave or won't they not invest anymore, that these are nonsense arguments with no actual backing in the material conditions of what actually changes. And so I think the trade-off is having to kind of push through the bullshit and the noise and just keep making sure we're telling the stories that are based in real life fact and win people over.
You would describe yourself as a populist?
So I think we need to define populism. You describe Nigel Farage as a populist, which is fair enough. Lots of people do, I think, including himself. He's not a populist. He's not a patriot either. So let's start with patriots. Patriots love their country. They want to invest in the country. They want to make sure that the local services are run in the local community area. They're not selling this country off to foreign investors. Then they've not got people within their MEP team who are found guilty on corruption and bribery charges with Russia and then keep changing that story. That's not patriotism. And it's not populism either. Populism is the 99% versus the 1%. Nigel Farage says he's a man of the people, but he's a man of the wealthy people. He literally wants to represent those 1%. So he can call himself a populist all he likes. He's bastardizing the word. The reason why I'm taking populist back is because what I want to see is working class communities alongside small business owners, people who don't work, disabled people, migrants, trans people, all the kind of culture war nonsense, and say, let's cut through that nonsense and recognise we have so much more in common. And the real problem here is a small elite group of people who largely own the media, who largely are donating to political parties, who are trying to distract and divide us.
It's interesting. I suppose a different view of populism is that populism fundamentally is about saying that there are a group of elites who are out to screw you, and we need to attack those elites and attack the institutions that are often dominated by those elites. I suppose, in a sense,
I don't think that's populism, though.
Well, I think it is a form. I mean, look, we can, as you say, we can argue all day about what populism is, but that's certainly one definition of populism. And you could say that that is something that does unite you with Farage. It's just that you're attacking a different sort of elite. You're saying the elites that he cares about, right, are basically cultural elites, right? He claims that what's happened to Britain is it's become dominated by people like, he would say, you and me, sort of liberal, cultural liberals, whatever, and they are in some way culturally alienating and do not represent the ordinary people of Britain. That's his critique. What you're saying is that there is an elite problem in Britain, but it's an economic elite problem, and Farage embodies that elite. So you are populist, you're just concerned about a different form of elites.
Well, I'd say he's not a populist because, again, it's that...
You think he's a fake populist?
Well, if he's saying the 1% is... If he's saying we're the 1%, then sure, he's a populist. But I think that's clearly absurd. We are not the 1%, right? And so...
Well, his argument is that basically cultural liberals over many decades have pursued their own political priorities, including mass immigration and so on, and therefore have basically not represented the ordinary, authentic people of Britain and not represented them in what they want.
Well, there's some intersecting conversations here, aren't there? Because I think, as with Farage, there's always some truth to what he says, and I think that's why he's often enormously popular. He's recognising what's going on in the country.
Is there anything you admire about him?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say admire, but I think something we can all learn from, those of us on the left or progressive people, is the way he connects with people's everyday experiences and their fears. The difference is, though, his solutions will often cause more division and actually make things worse. And they're often a house of cards built on lies. Ultimately, it all collapses. And I think that's why Farage and Reform are going after me so hard right now, because I'm someone that will look them in the eye and I will challenge them on their lies, and I will bring statistics and evidence to the argument, to every single argument. And I think they're really nervous about that because for a long time they've just got away with kind of... I was on TV with Carol Malone yesterday and it really struck me, not that she's in Reform, this is the Daily Express journalist. And when met with information in a calm way, she literally, and this is, anyone can go find the clip, she's just literally screaming at me. Her strategy is to not let me talk because she realises that
you have received extraordinary opprobrium from them in the last sort of, since you became leader, and particularly anybody who's seen the sort of digital content that has been sort of pouring out. It is very, very interesting. Why do you think that is? Because on one level, you could say, look, very often when these sorts of groups see, they could see you as a fellow traveller in one sense. They could say, look, this is a guy, we don't agree with this guy's prescription, but in a sense, he kind of shares our diagnosis, which is that there's a sort of, elite problem. The whole country is not being represented properly by the old duopoly, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and whatever. So they could almost see you as a kind of fellow traveller against the establishment, but they don't. They really don't. They have been going for you hard. What do you think the reason for that is?
Yeah, I think they're partly confused. It was interesting on Question Time. Zia Youssef used the phrase, "You might be surging in the polls, Zach." And I thought people don't use phrases like that by accident. That's been playing on his mind, that the Greens are surging in the polls. That's something they've been talking about in their meetings. It's also interesting, The Spectator just yesterday alone, I think, released 3 hit pieces on me in one day, 3 pieces in one day. And then you've got a Labour government that don't seem to know what to do with me. Both the Prime Minister and I think it was Sadiq Khan accused me of doing student politics or sixth form politics. Sadiq Khan, at the same time, though, when I was elected, he had a much more sensible approach. On the first day we were in public together, he said that he doesn't think he's seen someone enjoy a campaign so much. And I think he recognises that the positivity and hope I'm bringing is exactly how we should be campaigning right now. It's part of the way to challenge the far right, is not what Labour are doing, which is to appease them or even to occupy the same space sometimes, but actually to go, what does a tangible alternative look like that's built on hope and positivity, but isn't kind of abstract and in the air, but actually has policies and an actual plan to say, this is how we're going to take on the far right in this country. And so I think whether it's Reform or Labour, I think they don't quite know what to do with me. And it's that thing of, we saw some of this with leaders in the past too, where on one day I'm being painted as a clown that's incompetent and they don't know what to do with me. And on other days I'm a very dangerous Machiavellian man.
How's it been dealing with it? Because you are a relative ingenue to sort of national politics in this way. As you say, it's only been 35 days. You generated a huge amount of attention, which is to your political credit. You probably generated more attention than, I would say, every leader of the Green Party up to you combined, probably in 35 days or so. But it does come with a cost, and it does come with all of this attention, which has not been quite so positive. A lot of hit pieces, you say. How are you dealing with that?
Every time it happens, it propels me on, genuinely. I just think the worst thing would have been to be ignored. And actually, the second worst thing would have been...
Do you think they fear you?
I think they do, and I think they're right to fear us. We're about to overtake the Tories in membership, so we're at 110,000. The Tories are supposedly at 123,000, although Adam Ramsey, the Guardian journalist, has been doing some interesting work that looks at the amount of money the Tories have from membership, and it doesn't equal 123,000. So I think there's real questions for the Tories about what is your membership numbers. But as soon as we've overtaken the Tories, we're coming for Labour next, and I think Labour know we're coming for them, particularly next May at the local elections. It's really interesting. Before we even get there, I can be winning as Green Party leader and the left can be winning. Because Keir Starmer must be looking at those May elections and going, electorally, this is going to be an absolute massacre. The Green Party are absolutely coming for us on the left. So at this budget, they need to make sure there's some concessions to the left. And as soon as those concessions start to come, we're already winning without winning the seats. Now, of course, I want to win the seats. That's the point. But actually, the point of winning the seats in the first place was to get change in this country.
Do you see yourself as a sort of reform party for the left, in the sense that something that Farage has done, not just with Reform, with the Brexit Party, hitherto UKIP, is he has sort of acted as a magnet for the Conservative Party over 10, 15 years. He has gradually, through his electoral success, periodically, intermittently, he's gradually morphed the Conservative Party pretty much into his own image, and yet despite that has now at the point, potentially, of overcoming it, perhaps even destroying it, certainly permanently weakening it. Do you see your project as a version of that for the Labour Party?
No, because I think what's going to undo Nigel Farage's project, and I'll explain how the Greens are different, is the Doge whole thing, or dodgy thing, is very revealing. So in Kent, they sent Zia Youssef and the whole Doge unit to go make cuts at the council level.
Yes, it didn't work.
And then in the end, they've had to go with a begging bowl to national government and say this isn't working. There wasn't actually these unnecessary diversity projects or whatever they thought was there to cut. And so again, their project is built on lies. So when it gets put under the spotlight, there's nowhere to go. The Greens are very different to that. Do we have a fully formed project for government? I won't be disingenuous. No, we don't. You know, if I was suddenly to be in government tomorrow, I think that would be a rocky road.
Will you be going into the election hoping to be Prime Minister, or saying you think you could be Prime Minister?
I'm definitely not Joe Swinsoning this. And also, I think without that experience of government, I think that would be unwise. What I am saying, though, is I believe we have the credibility at the local level, certainly, where we're running administrations and getting better and better.
Would you like to be in government in some form?
Yeah, I absolutely want
You'd
to
like
see
to be in some
government.
form of coalition government?
For sure. I think that's...
Could you imagine supporting Keir Starmer as Prime Minister?
Absolutely not.
Are there any circumstances?
Not while the ongoing genocide is happening, not while... because I think the history of how Keir Starmer has been as Prime Minister, I think he has broken trust so much with both the left, but more importantly, the wider country.
Is there anything you admire about him?
Keir Starmer.
Mm-hmm.
So, weirdly, I know Keir Starmer fairly well,
really?
because we had lots of debates together in 2015 when I was a Lib Dem, so no one in the Lib Dems could find anyone who wanted to go debate. So my first debate ever in political history was against Keir Starmer and Natalie Bennett.
Really?
And actually, this was the start of me becoming a
Natalie
Green.
Bennett, one of your predecessors.
Yeah, who's former leader. So I went home to my boyfriend during that debate and said to him, the Greens are quite right about everything. Like, I'd never really considered themselves as a party. And then me and Keir Starmer had several debates together where Natalie Bennett and Sian Berry, the other former leader of the party, rotated. And it was then when I got really talking to Sian, talking about Green values, I was like, actually, I'd be much more at home in the Green Party. So I was only in the
Keir
Lib Dems.
Starmer is sort of responsible for you becoming a Green.
And what was interesting in that very first debate I've ever had as a politician, so I had no experience. It's 2015. And I'm basically there because I want to talk about proportional representation. That's always been something that's really important to me. And at the time, I didn't know the Greens cared about it because the Greens weren't really talking about it. Now, I'm not criticising the Greens for that. They had 10 seconds of airtime. So are you going to talk about the climate crisis or are you going to talk about proportional representation? And in that debate, it was a group of students. And Keir Starmer, as far as I remember, largely got booed even then. He wasn't even yet an MP for the way he was talking. And the way I was talking as someone with no political experience whatsoever, but able to connect with the students, because it wasn't that long since I was a student, being able to go, I can feel why people are angry with the Tories, and also why. So I think Keir Starmer was asked about like cannabis legalization, and he just gave the most kind of boring, dull answer.
So you were unimpressed with him?
Totally unimpressed. And then he was in a mess on HS2 because he was standing in Holborn and St Pancras, of course, where he's an MP for, and just didn't have a good argument for that either. So I already saw the seeds then. What I did think about him, though, was that he was honest and that he had integrity.
Do you still think he's honest?
No, I think we have seen... I mean, he's just not honest. We see that again. I come back to Gaza, but with a whole host of issues where he's gone out and defended the indefensible. And I think once you've reached that point, there's no way you can go into coalition with someone like that.
Let's just rewind a little bit and just talk about, which I haven't really heard you talk about very much, which is your early sort of political life and your early life, really. Because you were born in Manchester. You have spoken about that a little bit recently, obviously in the wake of the appalling anti-Semitic attacks. What propelled you into politics? Was it a very political life always?
Totally unpolitical. In fact, I could be shameful to admit this, but I've decided to own it. If you'd said to me in kind of just 10, 20 years ago who's the leader of the opposition, I wouldn't have known. It was
really
no interest.
As recently as how long would you say?
I would say, so I moved to America in 2005 to go train. And I think that's what started to politicise me. But before that, kind of no interest whatsoever. I remember voting kind of at 18, but having no real interest in who I was voting for.
Why was it what in America politicised you?
I think that was the first time I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and just kind of spending time, particularly in the gay black community, actually. Obviously, there's a huge black population in Atlanta and there's a huge gay population, and that intersection is there. And just seeing the deep kind of racism and segregation in that city, the immense poverty that sits alongside wealth. I'd never, up until 2005, visited London, or maybe I'd visited once or twice. I'd grown up in a very kind of Jewish community, very close to the Orthodox Jewish community. So I lived a pretty sheltered life in terms of other cultures, other communities. And then even going to university in 2001.
Have you been a victim of much anti-Semitism yourself?
Interestingly, not until the last 2 years. And since I've started speaking out on Palestine, that's when I've experienced kind of constant anti-Semitism.
In what way?
Largely on social media, but very often from people calling me a capo, which of course is the people who sold out Jewish people to the Nazis.
That must be difficult.
I mean, that is really difficult. And of all you always have to be careful to say what insults get to you because it can propel people. But actually, the vile anti-Semitism I experience of all the things is stuff that gets to me. People comment, never ending on things like my teeth. Bloody love my teeth. So, that one just never gets to me. I think like having a unique smile is something I enjoy about myself and I enjoy in other people. But the anti-Semitism, more than the homophobia, interestingly, does cut through. And I think it's because it's tied to the very deep emotive feelings around speaking out for Palestinians and the annoyance, frankly, at people who don't see the humanity in other people.
I almost hesitate to ask this because it's a complicated one, and so don't take it the wrong way, but I'm just interested because there's no reason you should, and plenty of British Jews don't. But I just wonder whether you yourself, despite the fact you have been so strident speaking about Gaza and Palestine, many British Jews who abhor what's been done in Gaza, nonetheless do feel an emotional connection to Israel, obviously the political project of Israel, which was in many ways such a noble one in 1948. Is that something that in any way appeals to you, or that you struggle with to talk about yourself, or to reconcile these things?
It's been really shattered. I grew up with a very, very strong emotional connection to Israel, and now it feels completely overshadowed, completely overshadowed by the need for justice and solidarity. I just think, how can you have an emotive relationship with something that's gone so badly wrong?
But you do think that Israel should continue to exist?
Well, I think that's a complicated question in terms of what is a nation state. Like, no nation state has a right to exist.
So you don't think Israel has a right to exist?
Well, that's seeking a headline in something that's much more nuanced.
No, I'm not. I'm genuinely not. I'm not. I think it's actually a reasonably straightforward.
Well, let's
question.
go back in history and say, why did Israel have the right to exist as it does? It was clearly because of the persecution of the Jewish people, something that's deep in my ancestry. I spoke in my conference speech about the fact that I reclaim the name Polanski, another thing that people try and attack me for endlessly. And it's just moronic because I've been very...
You weren't born, just to be clear, people won't know this, that wasn't the name you were born with.
Yeah, so I was born with the surname Paulden, but at 16, 17, 18 years old, I was hearing stories as I was learning about the Holocaust, about how my family history was largely in Latvia. They lived in an almost entirely Jewish community. There was pogroms, so they fled to Ukraine. Having been in Ukraine, there was then more pogroms, so they fled to Poland. Then, of course, they met the Nazis and so fled to the UK. And the story I was told growing up was that we had changed our surname to evade the Nazis. I then found out at 17, 18, as I was researching family history, that we were still Polanski when we arrived in the UK. In fact, it turned out it was Polinsky. But this is a very common Jewish experience, that because of written documents and running, there's often different names. And it was changed to Paulden to evade anti-Semitism in the UK. And despite, as we've just talked about, not being party political, I've always had like a strong sense of injustice and challenging injustice. And it just seemed really, really important to me that pride is no longer being ashamed of who you are or scared of who you are. I don't think it's coincidence either that this coincided with the times that I was talking about being gay too. So the sense of being totally open and unapologetic about who you are is all at the same time. And then to kind of wrap this section up, I guess, the first job that I was doing as a theatre actor was community theatre. So it's a project called Theatre of the Oppressed. This started in the 70s in South America under a man called Augusto Boal, which is all about going to minority or oppressed communities and role-playing. He calls it rehearsing the revolution. So finding out what people can do about their oppression. The trained actor, would play the oppressor, the policeman, the landlord, the politician, whoever it might be, and then the audience challenge them, and you keep replaying it until the audience feel empowered with the right arguments to challenge them. And I just got to the point where I love that work, and I still respect all my colleagues who do that. It's an amazing thing to be doing, but I felt like we weren't dealing with the systemic barriers, and actually you can empower someone to be the most articulate person in the world, but if the barriers are still in place, they can't get that. And that's when I got into formal party politics.
And I understand, and I'm not I understand why you're wary of it, but I'm just interested as part of this sort of richer conversation. I mean, in terms of that question, I mean, do you believe in a two-state solution to the Israel-Gaza conflict? Because if you do, presumably, then you must believe that Israel has a right to exist.
It's not that I'm wary of it, but my personal opinion is that a two-state solution is like a solution that has no tangible way of happening with everything that's happened. I don't think we're in this mess in the first place, largely because of the Balfour Declaration and because of the British response to Palestine and to Israel. And the idea that we need British politicians to wade in right now with what they think the solution is repeating history.
Presumably you would say that Ukraine has a right to exist.
So what I want to see is civic groups in Palestine and civic groups in Israel getting together. We've got what seems like a loose ceasefire. That's part one. We now need a peace process. But the idea that Tony Blair is going to be the person that leads that peace process is like putting an arsonist, in charge of a fire. But I don't think it should be any British politician who's in charge of that peace process.
But you're not willing to say that Israel has the right to exist?
It's not that I don't think... You just talked about Ukraine. I don't think it's that any nation state vis-a-vis has a right to exist.
Really?
Yeah, because I just think it's about who are the people in the changing history. I think it's about that people have a right to exist and everyone has the right to common humanity, equality.
But self-determination.
And self-determination.
Self-determination, which is expressed through the nation state. I'm just surprised that you wouldn't say that any particular state, at any given moment, has the right to exist.
Well, this is why it's a nuanced conversation. So self-determination has an absolute right to exist.
Yeah.
So a group of people have a right to
And the
self-determine.
Israelis have want to express that self-determination through their state.
And so do the Palestinians.
Indeed
And
so.
then that's
So
where
that's
the conflict comes,
of
right?
course.
So I think rather than going either one of those countries has the right to have their nation as an exist, what they have the right to do is for self-determination, for us to create a space where they can get together. And I'm talking about the civic groups rather than the warmongers and the leaders, and actually getting those civic groups together. Is that enormously complicated? Do I know how to do that? No, I don't. But I do know that if the will put their heads together and go, actually, the only way we can come to a genuine peace agreement is for politicians from other countries not to wade in with their ideas and their solutions, but go, let's facilitate a space where that conversation can happen.
And something that's interesting that you, I noticed when you were talking about Farage, is invoking this question of patriotism, saying he's not a true patriot. Would you say you're patriotic?
Yeah, absolutely.
You say you love Britain?
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have been more squeamish about the answer to that question.
Because people on the left often are, in a way that I find, I think it's problematic. It's one of the reasons the left often struggles to connect with people, particularly culturally, is that kind of like, you sometimes have those really tedious conversations with people like, I love all countries, or stuff like that. It strikes people as being odd, right?
And I guess it links with a conversation we were just having about nation states, but someone asked me recently if I support Welsh independence and Scottish independence.
Yes.
And the boring answer, I'll give you a more interesting answer. The boring answer as leader of the Green Party is, it's not my job to decide that. It's for Wales Green Party and the Scottish Green Party. They both support independence, and so I support what they decide. But if you're asking me on a personal level, I absolutely support their independence. So then the next question is, do I support English independence? And it really made me stop, because I thought, well, I've never thought about it in those terms.
Yeah.
And I've thought the right will absolutely have thought about it in those terms, in terms of English nationalism. So I think there's a huge, huge role to do right now to go, what does an English state look like? And how do we make sure we both recognise the history of England, both in terms of our problematic nature around colonialism and empire, but also the beautiful things of when this country has come together to fight fascism.
But to be clear, you're a party leader of a party with a slightly complicated structure, because as you say, it's different for different parts of the UK. But you do think it would be a good idea if the UK broke up?
I don't know if a good idea is a separate question to the one I'm answering, and I can come on to the good idea one. But the question is should people in those countries who have been screwed over by a Westminster government for decades and not been given their fair share, and there seems no obvious route to that getting better, they're saying we want to go independent. And as someone who believes in the principle of subsidiarity, which just means power being and self-determination.
But would you support it?
Yes, on a personal level.
So you do think it would be a good idea if the UK broke up?
Well, yes. Sometimes you have to go to the first question to get to the second question. I think it would be a good idea. I think,
why?
Because it's not working.
I thought we were stronger together.
Well, I
Surely
think
principle of principle of your politics, collectivism, solidarity.
Where it gets more complicated is if we had a Green government who genuinely cared about Wales and Scotland and genuinely looked at a way of the Barnett formula, for instance. So this is around HS2, the way Wales gets their money. This is one of
Barnett formula is quite generous to Scotland and Wales in lots of ways.
Definitely not to Wales. I think it's one of the most egregious examples of a country being screwed over, and everyone in England and just shrugging their shoulders and going, that's you don't have any power. That's clearly unfair. Now, if we had a Green government, I would like to think we would absolutely look at a way of making sure that Wales and Scotland had a fair settlement.
And in which case, what if London said we want to be independent?
Well, and again, I think this is an example of where you can recognise...
And then London would keep all its tax revenues and Wales wouldn't get all of the massive transfers which take place in Scotland. So then, isn't that why solidarity is important as a whole nation?
So I think you can both have solidarity and independence. So to talk about London, for instance, I frequently say, I don't think we should be asking for more money for London. And I say that as a London Assembly member. I do think, though, the fact that the mayor doesn't have his own tax-raising powers is absolutely absurd. We have so much wealth in London and so much poverty. And actually, if the mayor was allowed to do, say, a tourist tax or a wealth tax on the City of London, that would be a way of bringing lots of money to London. And also, I think other regions should have their fair settlements as well. We live in one of the most centralised democracies in the West, in terms of so much power sits with the Prime Minister. It's not a surprise to me that Wales and Scotland are grumpy about that.
Would it be a very good idea in this period where we're facing massive geopolitical threats for the UK, which for all of its faults, is still a big military spender, is still a linchpin, a staple of European defence, for us all to go our separate ways?
Well, this is an example of where Brexit has been one of the most catastrophic decisions I think this country's ever made. And Nigel Farage, who is at the centre of that decision, still has the audacity to be there front and centre stage.
So we should all be part of the EU. And that separatism was a bad idea. And that reclaiming of sovereignty was a bad idea. But Wales and Scotland going their separate ways That's a good idea.
So this is where I think actually I can hear the skepticism in your voice, but I think what I'm saying is utterly morally consistent and coherent. Because actually what I'm saying is the power should be at the most local level, and also it's really important to have umbrella organisations where you work together with
like
more
NATO.
formal arrangements. Well, so NATO is a really good example where this has been disastrous for a long time because of American imperialism. I think Donald Trump has been kind of the final nail in the coffin, where we have someone who, because of a so-called special relationship, we are outsourcing our security to. So the question is the umbrella you're working in working?
So in which case we'd need
Well,
to up
let me
our
finish the
defence spending.
sentence. Under the umbrella, that absolutely isn't working. We need a different umbrella. So it's not about leaving NATO today. It's about saying, let's work with our European partners. By the way, European partners are now saying this. They weren't last time we were having that conversation.
Sure.
European countries are now saying we might need a European Security Council that works across Europe, that actually says we are stronger together working in solidarity. Let's not be so reliant on Donald Trump.
That would mean that we'd have to up our defence spending. So
Not
would you
necessarily
support
at all.
What? So we're going to take away American defence spending, which is, as you yourself say, we have been reliant on their defence spending to protect us. But then we're going to separate, but not up our own defence spending?
Well, I think the question is, are we getting the right mechanisms for what we're spending money on right now? So we have homeless veterans sleeping on our streets, but we have a Prime Minister who is spending £15 billion on nuclear weapons. That seems absolutely ridiculous.
Would you be happy to lose? So if we lost our nuclear deterrent and the French lost their nuclear deterrent, and then we wouldn't have the American nuclear deterrent to rely on, you don't think that the Russians might choose to try and exploit that? That might put us in a rather frail position?
I feel like we've had this conversation so many times.
No, I think we've had it once, and I'm trying to do it in a slightly more sophisticated way, but I've never heard a good answer from you. So
I want a world without nuclear weapons. Now, I know you'll immediately go, everyone wants a world without nuclear weapons. That's like motherhood and apple pie. I think the first principle is to say, what do you want? And to not accept that that's impossible.
Would you be comfortable? So you don't think the Russians
in the same way that Nelson Mandela managed to secure peace with the ANC and we got peace in Ireland?
Why do you think the Estonians and the Latvians and the Lithuanians and the Finns and the Ukrainians would all completely disagree with you?
Because I think they're terrified about the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons, and I get that. So the first place to start is, how do we get Russia to denuclearize?
They won't.
Well, on the day we had this conversation on LBC, where it was much more fractious than it is now, the next day, Putin had a conversation with Trump about nuclear weapons. Now, has it resulted...
You believe Vladimir Putin?
Well, no, I don't believe him for a second. But even the fact that you were making it like this was the most absurd conversation in the world, and literally the next day,
it is absurd
that conversation was in the press. I think it is only possible if we show global leadership. And I think the first place to show global leadership is to say that the idea that having nuclear weapons makes us safer in a world of global turmoil is absolutely insane.
Do you believe that if we gave our nukes up, that it would make any difference to Vladimir Putin?
I don't think
he might bully us a bit more.
I think the way to do it is to have that conversation, to say, what does it look like if the world denuclearizes? How can we make that happen? Is that something that you even want? We've never had that conversation.
Well, okay, so if we get rid of nuclear weapons, would you be happy to up our defence spending on other areas, on the army, the navy?
Well, I think it's in response to what specific threat. The argument always is Russia is coming to invade us.
Yeah.
Russia are struggling with their nearest neighbours, Ukraine. Now, I don't mean to undermine the horrific massacre that is going on there, but I think the idea that Vladimir Putin is coming to invade the UK is quite jingoistic, and I think
he might be coming to invade our allies, the Finns, the Baltic states, the Poles, so we should just let them get on with it.
We shouldn't let them go on with it, but also the truth is they're not being invaded right now. And I think
that was true of Ukraine before 2022.
But these narratives are often pushed by the arms trade companies because ultimately this is a huge racket to make more money across arms.
But it wasn't the arms trade companies that made Russia invade Ukraine.
Right, which is also true. And by the way, just to be very clear, I stand with the Ukrainians in the same way that I stand with the Palestinians. If ultimately people are being invaded and they're innocent. And
you blame Russia for that war?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of this is important to recognise that we need to protect ourselves. We need to have security. But you're not asking me these questions about what are we doing to make sure we're secure from changing temperatures and changing climate? What are we doing to make sure that older people aren't dying in care homes?
It's not either or.
Or that, flooding is happening. It's not either or, absolutely. But we are not spending that money.
But if we end up in a European war, all of that stuff just goes out the window.
Well, okay, let me put this back to you. What is certain right now is that in the next coming years, we're going to face wildfires, we're going to face floods. You don't have to believe me, just look at the insurance companies. They don't mess around with money, and they are increasingly concerned about the effects of changing temperatures. We don't know that there is going to be a European war. Of course.
You could have said that in 1938, you could have said that in 1936. That's the argument, right? We need to deter. We need to make sure that Putin thinks that if he invades a NATO country, that is going to be so costly to him that he doesn't do
Well,
it.
all of this is about risk assessment, right? And I would say the chances of another pandemic are higher on that risk assessment. That doesn't mean we shouldn't defend ourselves. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be more secure. Absolutely, let's make sure we're more secure. But I think the biggest thing around defence spending is this idea that it's a function of your GDP. It literally makes no sense.
Do you think this
if the
defence stuff
economy is
is
doing
a
better,
weakness for you?
you assume that you're going to be more likely
Do you
to be
think this
invaded.
defence stuff is a because I mean, look, we've had this conversation, and you know we're doing it now in a more sophisticated way, which I'm glad about. But obviously that won't happen in the run up to election and so on. There's going to be all this stuff about defence and nukes and whatever. Do you think it's a weakness for the
I'm
Green
not sure
Party?
it is the most sophisticated way. I think that we
Well,
still
okay,
need to have a
sorry.
more nuanced conversation.
No,
about
I
this.
just think
And
what
that's just
you're
like
saying doesn't make much sense, but that's okay. We can agree
I
to
don't mean that
disagree.
as I think you're an excellent
No,
journalist, but I
know.
also think like the nature of these quick conversations means we don't all take a breath and go, actually, what does a more holistic conversation about defence looks like? Look, I'll answer your question directly. I do think it's a weakness because when you look at polling, the issue that we're trusted on the least at the moment is on defence, and I think it's often because these conversations happen, we don't have space to breathe. And actually, I think I know when I go to community centres, and I'm not being barracked is unfair to what you're doing right now, but kind of every question is not allowing me to finish my thought. It means you don't have time to create that wider narrative about what does a Green Party response to defence look like. The challenge to me, and it's one I absolutely want to take up in the long term, is I just did that video around cost of living and the wealth tax.
Very effective.
I've done a video about the climate crisis. At some point, I do want to start creating narratives about what does real security look like against pandemics, the climate crisis, and indeed imperialism.
I just wanted to ask you, before we wrap up, of course, about this question of another potential new entrant on your part of politics, on the kind of populist left type of politics, which is, of course, the spectre. I mean, it's been much vaunted, much talked about, not clear when it's happening or how, but of your party. This is the Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana outfit, which you're supposed to have got going. Is there any point to them now, do you think?
That's not for me to wade into, as tempting as it is. What I'm genuinely, and I think people can see this, is I'm so relentlessly focused on growing the Green Party. I'm relentlessly focused on, in the coming weeks, overtaking the Tories and being the real opposition to both this failing Labour government and taking the fight to reform. And I'm really determined on the actual issues like funding the National Health Service, on education, a lot of the issues that this alternative movement would presumably be talking about too, just making sure that people know that we have the policies on those issues. We're the party that has the momentum, the energy, the structure. And this May, these elections, voting Green is an absolute way to demonstrate to this Labour government that you're unhappy with them and you want an alternative.
Because Zara Sultana was asked about what is the point, given that you are, in this space and you're clearly doing very well and you're getting all this attention, you're getting all these new members, many of whom I suspect were members of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, and sort of see a kind of synergy between the two of you.
I want to focus on the cost of living crisis. I want to focus on inequality. And actually, I think they're important issues she's raising. We've just had a whole conversation for a long time about some of those issues. But actually, so I was on Jeremy Vine yesterday and he asked me about trans rights. And I answered that trans rights are human rights. And then he said to me, why do you keep talking about this stuff? And I said to him, I've been on your show 3 times in the last 6 months. And every single one of those 3 times you've done a segment on trans rights. I want to show solidarity to these people. I'm happy to talk about NATO, but actually the first things that come out of my mouth are always going to be either about the cost of living crisis or the climate crisis, and that's what I'm going to relentlessly focus on.
Do you think you've just left them behind? Your party?
I think, again, that's for people to decide. What I think is clear is the Green Party is growing at, can you say an unprecedented rate? I don't have the stats for that, but I think...
Well, if you don't, I don't.
Yeah, the speed at which the Green Party is growing right now, speaking humbly as the leader of the party, recognising it's not just about me, it's the entire movement, is incredibly impressive. And I think anyone who considers themselves on the left, who considers themselves a socialist, or indeed just a progressive, I mean, there are ex-Tories who say they can see under Kemi Badenoch that they have completely abandoned any sense of decency or caring about science or caring about nature, and they've joined the Green Party too. So I think there's an easy narrative here that we're just getting disillusioned Labour voters, but actually that's not showing up in the people who are joining us.
If they did launch, would that be problematic? Would that be difficult for you?
I'm really secure in what the Green Party are doing and the fact that we are becoming a huge major party. The fact that Alistair Campbell, someone whose politics I don't entirely align with, said yesterday...
Where?
On his podcast, he said yesterday that it's Farage versus Polanski or something like that.
Right.
And I think that is the narrative that's increasingly becoming true in this country. If you'd said to me 6 months ago when I was thinking about running for leader of the Green Party, do you think major commentators in this country or podcasts would be saying it is a fight between Farage and Polanski? Even in my kind of most visionary where I wanted to get to at this stage, I'd go, no, that's a few years down the line. We are so with the momentum right now, and we really have a clear story to tell that I think is bringing a lot of people of hope. So I'm focusing on us.
Would you like to say to Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana, look, just pack this in. You just come and join us. We're in this space. We're talking about the things you want to talk about. You don't need to waste your time setting up a new party. Come and join us. Would you like that?
I've shared more panels with Zara Sultana in the last couple of weeks than I've seen my boyfriend, and I said that to her the other day. We were in Manchester together on Saturday, and I said to her in the audience, I said, I've not come here to be partisan. We can have a whole conversation about what does relationships between the parties look like, or you could recognise that with a party that have immense amounts of members joining us, I like Zara, come join the Green Party. And so I'm not going to beg anyone to join the party. Anyone can decide where or what they want to be.
You'd welcome them.
Yeah, absolutely. I need to caveat that it's not my decision. That's up to the party. And I don't think we're in a place where, we need defections from MPs. I think we've clearly got the energy and momentum anyway. But at the same time...
Are you talking to any Labour MPs about defections?
I talk to Labour MPs all the time.
About defections?
It would... could you imagine if Labour MPs would continue to talk to me if I came on the newsagents and named the MPs that I'm talking to?
No, I'm not asking you to name them. I'm just asking, is there any interest?
Fair enough question. I'm talking to Labour MPs about defections, yes.
You are?
Yes.
How many?
I'm going to... I feel like the indiscretion is there, and I'm going to just leave it there.
Where does this all go?
I also want to say, though, that it's the same answer. I'd love defections, but I guess where I've changed since I become leader of the Green Party is I was dying for a defection a few months ago. I thought a defection is what gets us the attention and the energy to then get lots of members and be the real credible force in British politics. I think that's happened anyway. So I'd still welcome a defection because I'd rather people who are in the Labour Party who feel like it's not aligning with their values join the Green Party so they're able to speak up, and I think that would be good for the country. And also I think that would gain us even more momentum and energy. But I think we're in the place where we don't need defections at this point. I just think actually it would be really helpful for everyone to have a defection, but it's no longer my focus, which is an interesting shift.
Are you looking at people when you're looking at the politics in different parts of the world, talk about the US, are you looking at, say, Mamdani in New York, AOC, the way that they approach politics? Is that who you're taking inspiration from? Yeah,
definitely. I also would, I take huge inspiration from Mamdani. I can also be honest and say that I've spoken to members of his team that this thing is two-way. And so I think it's a group of people among the left right now in Europe and more widely who are recognising that for decades now, we've not been winning in the way that we should. And actually, when you poll our policies and the ideas, they're increasingly the popular ideas, just for various reasons, largely the broken electoral system. We've been stuck in this two-party politics that has left people voting for the worst option or the least worst option. I think undoubtedly that's breaking down now, particularly in this country. We now live in much more than a two-party system. And I think now that that cat is out the bag, the space for the Green Party to grow and the electoral success we can have both in May at the local elections and the general election is starting to become limitless. I think the real question then becomes, how do you match the resources you have with electoral ambition, where you're not capping it with your resources, but actually you're being as ambitious as possible while still being pragmatic about what can be achieved in the shortest possible time? What I would say is I'm constantly reevaluating that, because what would have felt hugely ambitious 6 weeks ago is suddenly making us go, are we being ambitious enough?
Zack Polanski, it's been an absolute pleasure to
talk
to you.
Thank you so much.
Hope you come back. Despite the stratospheric heights, just don't turn up.
Too good for the news agent.
Just don't turn up on that Campbell outfit. That's what I'll say. Zach, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.